And greetings, everyone. Welcome to Astral Perceptions, a show dedicated to examining the outer fringes of our reality and bringing them to the forefront of our awareness. I'm your host, Mark Johnson, and I want to welcome everyone back to another show. I hope you've enjoyed the other shows that we've been doing lately. I've been getting a lot of great feedback. Of course, I'm always open to more feedback, so please feel free. You can reach out to me on Facebook, or you can email me at mark@paukradio.com, as we are part of the Paranormal UK radio network. And we're going to have another great guest this week. In fact, this guest is one of our co-hosts here on one of our shows on the Paranormal UK radio network, Neil Geddes-Ward, who is the co-host along with Andrew Chaplin of the Paranormal Peep Show. Now, Neil has a very eclectic background. He's a pagan visionary artist. He's produced artwork for publication and prints. He's appeared on TV and radio discussing strange paranormal dreams, fairies, ghostly encounters, UFOs, a whole variety of different subjects. And tonight we are going to be speaking specifically about an upcoming book that he's working on, Encounters with Fairies, Ghosts, and Spirits. And this definitely has a very British slant to it, and I'm really looking forward to it. So, Neil, welcome to the program.
I'm very well, thank you, Mark. Thanks for inviting me on the show. It's good to see you and be back chatting to you in these winter months.
Oh, yes, as winter is quickly coming. Actually, it just turned fall, but it feels like winter already.
Yeah, it's getting pretty cold over here now. People are very, very worried about their heating bills and the cost of living and everything like that.
Yeah, I'm not looking forward. My house runs on propane here, so I have to. I'm waiting to see what it's going to cost to fill my propane tank for the winter.
Oh, I think you better nip down to Florida and pinch whatever NASA's using.
Yeah, it's the sunshine mainly.
Yeah, exactly.
Being up here in the Northeast, we had a really hot winter, and when that usually means we're gonna have a really cold, maybe snowy winter. So, not looking forward to that.
Yeah. Buckle down the hatches, as they say, and come out in the spring.
Well, I was not long ago. I was a guest on the Paranormal Peep Show with you and Andrew, and so now you're a guest here on Astral Perceptions. And so wanted to talk a little bit about your work and looking into the fairy lore over there in the UK. Now, what would you call it? I mean, I've heard it called Celtic fairy lore, or I mean, what? I don't know that much about it. I've heard some things, but
I would not really classify it in any particular pigeonhole of Celtic or whatever. I think that's more of a marketing angle for authors myself. Maybe I'm being a bit cynical about that. I don't know. I think, like the Native Americans have had legends of the people of the mountains or the people of the woods, that kind of thing. The little people. So, you can come from any kind of aspect of where you're from, I think, and you just put your own slant on it, really, whatever that phenomenon may be.
Well, I mean, I interviewed last week Mary Joyce. Now, we were talking about something completely different, but in the past, I've talked with her about North Carolina. The Cherokee people talk about the little people.
Yeah.
The brown little people and of course, you have in Iceland, Icelandic elves, you have Middle Eastern jinn, you have pretty much every culture has talk of little folk.
That's right. Yeah. I mean, so over here, they're not normally called the Fae, but I think people that are much more into it like to refer to them as the Fae people, or the fairy kingdom, as it's more widely known about. And, mostly you hear stories circulating from Ireland and Scotland, maybe Wales, not so much in England. I mean, the story we have in England would actually turn out to be a fake one, which was the Cockney Fairies. I don't know if you know that one.
I'm familiar with that case.
Yeah. The two girls that had cut out the drawings and stuck them on hat pins and put them by their garden and photographed it on an old kind of camera They look good, but unfortunately, they were definitely fake. I had suspicions they were fake when I first saw the pictures, I must admit.
Yeah, and what's ironic about that is Arthur Conan Doyle even got fooled by them.
Yeah, yeah. Houdini was apparently alongside him, kind of looking at. Well, certainly he was portrayed in the film of the story, which I think was called Fairy Tale, made in the mid-90s. But yeah, Houdini was involved in it in some way, I believe. But it was actually the magician James Randi, who, I mean, he may not have been the first to point it out, but I saw a film of him pointing out the fact that the photographs of these girls with the fairies in the brook was taken on a long exposure camera. In those days, you didn't have fast shutter speeds or anything like that, and everybody had to keep still for maybe 20 seconds or something. And the trouble is, where the river was behind them was obviously being exposed during that 20-second period, but it was still flowing. So when the picture was finally developed, the picture of the river behind them was actually showing a blurred, misty looking river, because obviously it was a long exposure and just kept moving. And he said that the fairies in the foreground in front of the little girls had no movement whatsoever. If they were meant to be dancing, there was no movement. Their wings weren't flapping or blurry or anything like that. They were absolutely pin sharp, which showed that they were still for at least 20 seconds. And that kind of highlighted the fact that they were definitely fake.
Well, if I remember correctly, and it's been years ago, I thought that they had actually discovered the book of illustrations where the girls got the fairies and
Yeah,
cutouts.
that's right. Yeah, I thought they came from magazines or something at the time, because this was about 1912 or 13 or something like that, maybe just before the Great War. And these girls, I think, were about 15 or 11. They were cousins, and they obviously read magazines, maybe belonging to their mother or something. And they had literally either traced over these drawings from fashion magazines or something, whatever they were, and then just artistically created the fairy wings. But one of the cousins, actually maintained that one of the photographs was genuine. Now, I don't know whether that was just a way of kind of still having some sort of respect or something at the very end of the day, because she had let slip, or admitted after her cousin had died, she had let slip that yes, they did fake the pictures, but she always maintained up until the point that she died that one of the pictures was real. But they also maintained that they generally saw fairies, but they couldn't prove it. So they decided to go ahead and fake these photographs to try and get people to believe them. But I kind of backfired on them a little bit. But she said once Sir Arthur Conan Doyle got involved, they couldn't really back out of it because it was just getting too big, and they just kind of shuffled their feet and gritted their teeth because they were just doing it for a bit of a laugh, I understood. And it just got out of hand. And so they were kind of cornered and they didn't know what to do. And they were only young and a bit naive, I guess.
Well, in a way, that just goes to show how intrigued people were back then, even to now, in the whole concept. The ideas of fairies, leprechauns, gnomes, elves, whatever you want to call them, these types of creatures, which definitely have what used to be thought of as magical properties to them. I look at it more along the lines of possibly interdimensional properties.
Yeah, yeah, they certainly seem to have this kind of quality. I mean, one of my stories that I researched some years ago, I may have told this before, maybe 5 or 6 years ago to you, but I'll tell listeners again, was in a film by a Canadian filmmaker called John Walker. And the film was called The Fairy Faith or something like that as well. Fairy Tale was the film, not Fairy Faith. I'm confusing films. Fairy Faith is a film by John Walker. Fairy Tale was a film made in the 90s of the Cottony Fairies. So, yeah, The Fairy Faith by John Walker. He had gone to various places, the Scottish Highlands and also Ireland itself. And he met a guy there who had come from Glasgow and gone on to Ireland for a holiday. And he was apparently, according to his tale in the film, he was walking around on holiday near this fairy hill. It was called Fairy Hill locally, but he was intrigued because he could hear a strange kind of weird music which he couldn't track down. And that's kind of common in fairy encounters. You hear this music and you can never place it, and you follow it and follow it and follow it, and you just don't know where it's coming from. And so he said that as the sun was parting, the sun was coming through the clouds were parting, it just rained, and he said he saw a perfect rainbow forming over the valley. He was very intrigued by this sight and was really taken with this wondrous sight of the beautiful valley of Ireland. And he said out of his peripheral vision, there was some movement down by his feet, but he didn't want to kind of look down and see what it was. He thought he'd carry on looking at the view before him. But all the time there was this movement down by his feet, and it really started to bug him. So he looked down, and he said he saw this small woman with brown, leathery-looking skin. And I don't know how big she was, maybe a couple of feet, a foot, I'm not quite sure. She had brown, leathery-looking skin, a kind of leathery-looking hat, and he said she appeared to have an old pair of something like sheep shears, like old pair of sheep shears which you cut the fleece off a sheep, something like that it was. She was holding in her hand, and he said she was cutting around the sole of his shoe. And he said where his shadow extended, he said there was the male equivalent of this being, the husband, if you like, same leathery looking skin. They were both pretty ugly looking creatures. And he said that this male being was rolling up this guy's shadow like paper. And this guy just looked at them and said, "Oi!" in surprise, because he didn't know what else to say. He was just completely shocked. And it's like something was being stolen from him. But in this case, it was like something that defies physics. It was the guy's shadow. How can that be stolen? But he said as soon as they looked at each other in surprise and thinking, this guy can see us. Oh, my God, we've been discovered. And they both went psh, and vanished completely. And this guy said he'd hate to think what would happen if he had not looked down and they got away with it. What would have happened to him psychologically, physically, emotionally, spiritually? Don't know. Really weird tale, though.
That is a strange tale. How long ago or how old was that tale?
Well, I saw the film about 2004. I suspect it happened maybe in the 1980s, 80s or 90s. I'm not quite sure.
So not ancient.
Not an ancient, yeah.
last
I mean, the guy was a construction worker called Steve Odell from Glasgow. Anyone who wants to hear the story from his lips, go onto YouTube and look up The Fairy Faith by John Walker, because I definitely know the film is up there on YouTube now.
Okay. Now, see, that's the one thing here over in the U.S. especially, and I can blame Walt Disney for this. Even Grimm's fairy tales, though, can also be blamed about the depiction we have of fairies, of these little, friendly winged creatures flying around, spreading pixie dust but the true ancient fairy lore can be quite dark at times. I mean, it's not that these things are evil per se, but it's like almost every other type of phenomenon out there that we've ever researched, from ufology to cryptids, and mystical like the fairy folk. There's good and bad, and some people have had some very negative encounters.
Yeah, I mean, this guy seemed to have some sort of negative encounter, and as I say, it seems to have defied physics. How can you remove someone's shadow? And it made me think about it, the fact that they were there to steal his shadow, but it had previously been raining and the sun had only just started to come out. So it's almost as if they'd been lying there in waiting for the sun to come out too, because they were seeking that opportunity with the sunlight to then grab the guy's shadow whilst it was forming. But they must be doing it all the time. And it's only the fact that he must have had some sort of psychic ability or something to see these creatures that they were discovered. So they could be going around stealing human shadows quite unbeknownst to them, when they're sitting down, laying in the fields. But the fact that it was near this place called the Fairy Fort or the Fairy Hill suggests that these beings might have been experienced or seen at this location before, and that's why it became known as the Fairy Hill. So there's lots of legends where these fairies are supposedly, that people believe they come out of the hill, which may be true, I don't know, but there's lots of places around Scotland known as the Fairy Fort, the Fairy Hill, or Fay Hill, anything like that. They seem to be associated with mounds. Now, that takes me on to something I've been researching very recently, to do with gnomes, which sounds absolutely crazy. Who believes in gnomes? You only get them as garden gnomes. But There was a case that happened in 1979 in the county of Nottinghamshire, which is in England,
Mhm.
and it was 5 or 6 kids that played in these woods in Nottinghamshire. It was like a park area, and it was like 8 o'clock at night. It was just getting dark, and apparently they said that they'd seen them before, but on this second occasion, they said that they saw what they described as looking gnome-like creatures coming out of the trees in the darkness of the woods, but somehow they could still see them. They described them as having the kind of big floppy hats that gnomes had, with the kind of fluffy ball thing at the back. They had long beards. Uh, Weirdly, all the children described them having long beards with a red tip at the end, apart from one child who said they were white beards. So, not quite sure why there was a slight difference. But this is the really weird thing. They weren't just walking around these gnomes, they were driving around in little cars, or something that they called little cars, which,
Okay.
yeah. And they weren't like cars that we'd imagine them. They were weird cars. There's 2 gnomes per car. They seemed to hover. They didn't touch the ground, and they could go over logs without any problem. They seemed to have something like headlights, but they were more triangular, these lights. The steering wheel appeared to be more like a disc with a kind of handle on it that they would turn or something, but they also had to lean the vehicles left or right to then bank left or right. And they chased these children around the woods, all of these vehicles, and these gnomes appeared to be laughing at the kids. Now, the children's headmaster at the school, he actually interviewed them on a tape recorder and asked them all individually what they had experienced. And they all pretty much said the same thing. They related the story of how one of their friends had fallen in the water after being chased by the gnomes. They all had the same story, all corroborated quite well. Apart from one of the differences saying I saw a gnome with a white beard rather than a black beard. Um, but they said that these gnomes were laughing and they spoke in a language that they didn't understand, but they were very small beings, maybe only 1.5 feet high, but they strongly resembled gnomes, and they were chasing these kids around the woods. And the headmaster was asking, well, did they harm you in any way? And they said, no, they didn't harm us. They seemed to be friendly towards us. They were chasing them almost as if it was a game. But interestingly, they said that gnomes would only come out, and they seemed to come out somewhere out of a hole in the tree or something like that. They would only come out in the dark because they felt that if they went into the sunlight, which again we're back to this sunlight issue, shadows and things like that. When they went into the sunlight, they felt that they would be harmed by the sunlight, which is a strange thing as well. Because then it ties up a little bit with the idea that ghosts come out at night, and you're thinking, why does that idea of ghosts coming out at night come along? Maybe there's something to do with sunlight that is harmful to spirits. Now, I'm not saying these things were definitely gnomes, but this is what the kids said they were, because I've heard of something called screen memories, which is what supposed aliens have, and they can put a
Mhm.
screen memory from your child onto you whilst you're having an abduction experience. But to make it more pleasing, they kind of tranquilize your mind a little bit with something from your past, and it could be Noddy or something like that, the Teletubbies or whatever's your fancy as such. And these children claimed that these creatures were gnomes in cars. Now, they could have been aliens in flying saucers, but this is a screen memory put on them. The fact they were small as well could suggest they were small grey beings. I don't know, but no one actually asked the question or knew much about screen memories in 1979 to ask those specific questions. So they just took it at face value that these were gnome-like creatures. But it's a very strange case, whatever it is.
That makes a lot of sense in a lot of ways, because again, the children all saw them one way except for the one child who saw the beard a different color. Um, in a way, and this isn't exactly related to fairy lore, but Irene and I had discussed during a paranormal UK radio show a couple of times where she and her husband had an experience trying to get to the airport to fly up to Scotland for a relative's funeral. They got lost and they picked up this stranger who said, "Oh," they asked him directions and he goes, "It's better if I show you." And he just climbed in the car. And then he was telling them, "Okay, turn here, turn there." They got to like almost up to the airport and he goes, "Okay, you can drop me off here." And he gets out, and when they turned to thank him, wasn't there, gone.
Mm.
And then when they talked later, they both started describing him, and they described him completely differently.
Wow.
So whoever or whatever it was certainly helpful. But yeah, I think it was giving a type of screen memory to both of them, and they
Mm.
both saw it in different ways. You're right; it's very similar to what UFO experiencers have talked about. Even the Betty and Barney Hill case, one of the most famous and early documented abduction cases. Both Betty and Barney had very different screen memories before they went under regression.
Mm.
So these types of beings, you talk about gnomes. I don't know if you saw this. It's a little older. It's about 10, 12 years old. I saw a brief video clip of a cryptid on YouTube that looked exactly like a gnome,
Mm.
filmed in South America, where
Wow.
people were sitting there, and of course it's grainy with a cell phone video, but you see this short, squat creature, mostly in silhouette, wearing a tall, pointy hat, like gnomes are
Yeah.
projected to wear, and it not walked but sidestepped with short stubby legs out of the bushes to get to a certain point, and then the kids who saw it screamed or whatever in the way after they filmed it, and it went running back into the bushes. But
Wow.
it was a weird shuffling sidestep coming out, and it was very clear. But it could be a fake, but the proportions of this being definitely was only about 2.5 feet tall, very squat, very compressed, not like a child.
Mm.
You can kind of see a beard, but again, it was mostly in silhouette. But
But
the weird clothing and pointy hat, first thing you look at, you think, "Oh my God, gnome."
yeah, I mean, if you're going to fake it and say I'm going to fake an alien or something, why would you pick a gnome as your kind of main character to do? Now, it's interesting, whilst we're on the subject of these gnomes, because our good friend Philip Kinsella, host of Twin Souls, he had an experience. I think it was back in 1989, the winter of '89, as I recollect him telling me, where he had been taken up into a ship, and I think it was more astrally rather than physically. But he said he was there, and when he managed to come down out of the ship, he said he found like a small man at the door of his house. I think it was the back garden door or something, or kitchen door. But he said he had a hat like Noddy, Enid Blyton's Noddy character, a kind of gnome thing. And he said that this man, I think this man had a beard, but he said he was certainly very angry. Philip was trying to ask him how could he possibly pass through glass, because apparently Philip had passed through the glass window or the door on the way up to the ship, and he couldn't understand how he'd done that. So he was asking this man, how did I pass through that? And this man apparently had his arms folded and had a big frown on his face, like, you shouldn't be asking me that, and how come you're awake, or something like that. But he described him, he actually called him the Noddy character. So
Huh.
here is another show of these gnome-like creatures. So whether they're alien or, I mean, we have these legends, and you've got to wonder, where do gnomes come from? Where do the idea of gnomes come from? And it could be that these beings have existed all the time, and we just put them down to children's fairy tales, but there could be some substance because there's people that have cited such things.
See, I liken it to every culture having stories of these mostly invisible or hard to see creatures, mystical creatures. I mentioned earlier, Iceland has the elves,
Mm.
and they also have mounds where they believe these elves live. And the government of Iceland so believes in this that they literally have built highways around these mounds
Yeah.
rather than go through them to not upset the fairy
Yeah.
or the gnomes, elves. I mean, God, I'm all over the place. But even Iceland is a very popular filming location for Hollywood. A lot of big movies are filmed in Iceland. Television shows now are filmed there because of the stark landscape. And I've heard that most of these film companies, whenever they go out to the location, they perform a little ceremony to appease the elves so
Interesting.
that nothing happens during the shoot, because there have been reports of when they don't do that, camera equipment breaks. They start having all the accidents on the set. They have all sorts of technical difficulties that they blame on the elves. So they do a little offering to appease them, and that usually gives them a smooth shoot. Um, I've dealt with a couple of cases here in my paranormal research where, it started off as what sounded like a haunted house case. And then the more I researched it, the more I started to believe there was something attached to the land that was very similar to the stories of the fairies or the gnomes or elves, these types of, and I call them interdimensional beings, but who knows? I mean, we're guessing here at this point, because they seem to be able to fade in and out of our reality, or at least in and out of our sight. A lot of times they're invisible, and they cause poltergeist-like activity. The client had looked out her back window one night and saw this shadow man figure just standing in the woods staring at a house. Well, she lives on a hill. Very hard to get back there. And there's this creature, or this person, was standing there staring for a while before it vanished. Still another time, she called me up one morning, totally freaking out, saying, "Oh my God, Mark, you're not going to believe what happened. You're just not going to believe me." And it took me 10 minutes to calm her down, to say, "I will believe you. Tell me the story," because she was so afraid to tell me. And she said she woke up in the middle of the night, and across the bedroom by her dresser, there was this white, misty figure. And she watched it for a moment, and she thinks she must have made a noise, or her husband made a noise. And this thing turned around, and she goes, "Mark, I'm dead serious. It was a flippin' alien."
Wow.
It looked like exactly like a gray alien. Of course,
Mm.
she didn't use flippin'. Um, with the thin, very thin black eyes, whatnot, and it vanished. Well, she has not had any indication of any type of UFO, what I would consider UFO or abduction activity on that property. In fact, the whole neighborhood has been experiencing things. We investigated the lady's house directly across the street, and for several years we did intense investigations of both houses. And that's when we started coming to the realization that there was something there on the land that wasn't human.
Wow.
And it was mischievous, sometimes negative, other times not. I mean, it was really hard to classify. And I think it falls into the same category as what we're talking about with fairies or elves, or these other legends, or even the Native American legends out here,
Mm.
that talk about these different types of creatures and beings.
Mm. Yeah, I mean, it's amazing that I mean, if you told someone like a skeptic that these kids had seen these gnomes driving around in cars, of course they're going to go, "Oh, what rubbish! What they must have been eating magic mushrooms." But the fact is, all their stories kind of tallied up with each other, regardless of what it actually was. They still tallied up, and they could all vouch for each other. And a similar case happened where someone could vouch for someone else on an extraordinary encounter with a guy I used to work with, because you mentioned someone that you know personally. This was a person that I used to know many years ago. I worked at a broadcasting place, and I'd work shifts there. And in the evening, this guy, he was a security guard. He originally came from the Caribbean islands. I don't know which particular island he actually lived on, but he said to me, "I don't believe in ghosts and ghoulies and things that go bump in the night." He was adamant about that. He says they don't exist. I just don't believe in them. But then one evening in the kitchen area of the place that I worked at, he was talking to a girl, and I overheard the conversation, and all I heard was him saying she was white as that fridge freezer. And I thought, "Oh, this sounds ghostly. I'm going to butt into this conversation." So I said, "What are you talking about there, Owen?" Because his name was Owen. And he goes, "This woman I saw." I said, "What woman?" He says, "Well, she was sitting on the roof of a church." I went, "What's a woman sitting on the roof of a church for?" And he said, "Well, what happened was he was in a bar in, I'll say St. Lucia is an island that I know of out there. So I don't know where, but maybe it's St. Lucia. Um, he was in a bar there with his friend. Now, I know that they're in a bar and they're probably drinking alcohol, but I have to say this, that alcohol does not induce hallucinations as people might think. It just gets you a bit drunk
You
and
don't see
staggery.
pink elephants.
No. They might have done back in the Middle Ages when they used to actually add magic mushrooms to it back in the Middle Ages, but they're not allowed to do that now. So it just gets you drunk on the alcohol. You
Right.
don't hallucinate visionary things, that's certain. But people always want to jump to the conclusion, oh, well, they've had alcohol, no wonder. Ask any drunk, they don't hallucinate things. So they'd been drinking in this bar. I don't know how much so, but anyway, they said they walked home the normal route, and their normal route took them past this church up the hill. And as they rounded the corner to go up the church, past the church, there on the roof of this church was this woman sitting there. And I laughed, but I said, "Why is a woman sitting on the church roof?" And he said, "This was no ordinary woman. She was at least 50 foot tall." I went, "What?" Yeah, 50-foot tall woman. Sounds like a sci-fi movie, doesn't it?
Yeah.
And apparently she was sitting on the church roof, leg either side of the church roof, like you would sit on a doll's house, maybe. And I always joke to people, this is why the church is always trying to raise money for the church roofs, because they've always got 50-foot women sitting on them. Um, but apparently she had long white hair, very pale white face, and a long white kind of robe, gown, or dress, or something, attire on her. And she was sitting on this church roof. But both of them saw him. His friend and Owen both saw the same thing, because his friend ducked and hid behind a gravestone to hide in fear. So Owen looked down at him and said, "You can see this too," because he wanted to say, "Are you seeing the same thing as me?" And his friend said, "Yeah, I see it." So Owen, being the brave of the two, he said he picked up a rock and he threw it as hard as he could at this 50-foot woman. I wouldn't advise people to do this. And it went straight through her, he said. And I said, "Well, then what happened?" He said that this woman stood up. So in other words, that she was reacting. She was reacting to them. So it wasn't like a hallucination or weird phenomena. She was interacting with them because she stood up at the point this rock passed through her. She stood up and stepped off the church and started to walk towards them. You don't want a 50-foot woman. You've just run a rock out walking towards you. But apparently he said she shrunk in size to the size of a normal person and then just dissolved into the ground. But he still said, "I don't believe in ghosts, ghoulies, and things that go bump in the night." He was in denial. He didn't
Absolutely.
want to accept that reality. But him and his friend both saw it.
But
Amazing story.
that's a favorite phrase of mine. I heard it in a movie a while back. It says, "Never underestimate the power of denial."
Yeah.
People can see things and they'll do everything in their power to explain it away because it goes so against their paradigm and their belief system that it's a shock to the system. And then if they admit that that's real, then what else is real or what else is, and they can go through an entire paradigm shift.
Mm.
People like me who slowly had their paradigm shifted and changed over a course of many years, because there's things that I look at, and I hate to use the word believe. It's not that I believe, it's just that I just accept that there are things out there that are beyond our understanding, where maybe 20 years ago, even though I was spiritual and into certain things like ghosts and spiritual concepts, you tell me something like that gnome story and I just laugh and say that's absolute baloney.
Yeah.
But now, with what I've learned, and the older I get, the more I talk with people like yourselves, and we share ideas. The more I'm accepting that there are things out there we just don't understand. It might be beyond our comprehension. We have things in the woods. Uh, thing that's another good topic is the fact that how many people disappear every year that
Mm.
go into these woods, whether it's the national parks here in the US or even over there in the UK, people who vanish for no reason. Maybe
Mm.
some of them are found later dead in places they could not have been,
Yeah.
or they come back with no memory and they're kind of in a daze and maybe they've been gone for weeks, but
Mm.
they only remember being gone a few minutes ago. So
And in the Middle Ages, when fairies were blamed for lots of things and people went missing, and they'd normally go away for like 6 or 7 years in some cases, but the person was convinced they'd only been gone a day. Um, but they were blamed on the fairies. Now, in today's world, we might blame aliens or something like that. So, our kind of cultural perceptions or framing of this phenomena is shifting through the ages. Because I think it was Jacques Valley connected fairies up with aliens and said there's lots of similarities between the two, and he did wonder if they were the same thing. And I know that people like John Keel, the researcher, author, had kind of suggested that alien phenomena was perhaps coming from this other place where all these other things, spooks, ghosts, spirits, come from. And they're kind of like, they could be separate entities within that other world, and they're all coming through somewhere, or they're just coming through at different times, trying on different suits of camouflage to interact with us in some way, depending on the culture they're approaching. I mean, it's interesting that I spoke there about the church, because I met a guy on a plane about 15 years ago now. We were all going out to Spain on a family holiday. One of the last guys to get on the plane, I thought he was a Spaniard because there was loads of Spaniards heading back to Spain on this trip. And it turned out that he was from Iran, but he lived in London. And he said, I call it Persia, but today's world calls it Iran. And I said, oh, what, you going on holiday? And he goes, no, no. He said, I'm an architect and I'm going out to check on some of the buildings that I've been project managing and everything like that. So he said, what do you do? And I said, well, I've just co-written this book called Fairycraft, and we run a fairy museum, which we did at the time in the Orkney Islands in Scotland. And I told him the story, which I first told you, of the guy having his shadow cut from his foot. And, I just sort of thought, well, I'll test the water with it. I'll tell him that weird story. And I think that he opened up to me, because had I just been an ordinary kind of person, we would have just spoken about the weather and holidays or whatever. But he actually started to open up, and he wouldn't perhaps told anybody else. So he said, I said something like, I said, I think science is just getting its hand on the door handle of this new reality, but we haven't quite opened the door yet. We haven't quite seen what's there. And he goes, yeah, I agree with you. He said, when I was a conscripted soldier back in Iran, and I would put this, given his age and the time, probably in the early 1980s, I would say roughly, maybe late 70s. I wasn't sure. He never said. But I think he was 47 at the time, so I tried to clockwork it back to roughly that sort of period of time. He said that he was, patrolling the streets late at night with an army friend, army buddy, his colleague, and then it was their job just to, check the streets, make sure it's all safe or whatever they had to do. But he said a sandstorm kicked up, and they sought shelter. And the nearest place for shelter in this particular case was a mosque. Again, a religious building. We just had a church here with a giant on it. This was a mosque, which is part of the Muslim kind of place of worship. And he said that they went in there and they took their shoes off, which is customary in a mosque to do so. And this guy, I always call him Hussein, he said to his army buddy, you sleep and I'll keep a watch out, make sure there's no trouble. So he goes, okay. So his friend fell asleep, laying next to him against the wall. Hussein said he sat with his back against the wall and he had a gun with him. He said no matter how hard he tried to stay awake, he was so tired he kept nodding off to sleep. Yeah, so Hussein, his army friend, fell asleep, and Hussein had the gun with him, and he sat with his back against the wall, and he said no matter how hard he tried to stay awake, he kept falling asleep. And he said he fell asleep 3 times, and each time kept waking up going, oh, I must stay awake, I must stay awake. And on the 3rd time he fell asleep, and he woke up again. On this occasion, he said there was 2 people in the room with him and his friend. And he thought, where did they come from? And he said it was a woman and a young girl he thought to be about 12 years of age, and they were crouching down, both looking at their feet. They were looking down at Hussein's feet, and the young girl was looking at his friend's feet. And he thought, where did they come from? So they hadn't looked up at this point. They're closely looking down at their feet like that, examining their feet. So Hussein said he tried to get his elbow and press on his buddy's chest to try and wake him up. He said no matter how hard he pressed on his chest, he wouldn't wake up. So he said he decided that he didn't want to be there. And I don't know why he did this. He said he started to wrap the strap of the gun around his arm so the gun wouldn't swing as he ran away. But this was the guy with the gun. I don't understand why he was be scared, but he didn't have a good feeling about it. And he said it must have caught the eye of this woman, because as he was wrapping the strap of the around his arm, this woman suddenly looked up, and he said, as soon as she looked at me in the eye, he said, I knew without a shadow of doubt that she was not from this world. There was some connection that just told him that she wasn't from this world. And he said at that point, the woman stood up and the young girl stood up next to her, and they turned and they walked away. And he said, as they walked away, he noticed they both had cloven-hoofed feet like goats, and they walked through and vanished into the wall of the mosque. And this was an ordinary architect guy telling me this story. Again, associated with a religious building, a mosque, maybe prayer power does it. Maybe it becomes like an energy center or a portal or something like that. But this is perhaps where the legends of like Pan comes from, with the cloven-hoofed thing. And it also kind of, if you rewind the story back again, the women, the two girls, were staring at their friend's feet and his feet because they were curious about their feet. So to them, the human feet were the oddities, and they were curious about them.
And how large were these?
These were normal-sized people.
Normal-sized people.
Yeah, he gauged the girl to be about 12 years of age, and the one, I don't know, 45 or something, maybe in his mind, you know. But he said as soon as they stood up, they walked away. The only difference that he could tell that there was something odd about them, they both had cloven-hoofed feet. And as soon as he told me that, a chill went down my spine.
I imagine.
Yeah.
Now, I've heard of, I saw on one show back in the old days, Ghost Hunters, when they first came out, they did some episodes in Ireland, and they were at this one old dilapidated house, but in the fields behind were supposedly what Barry Fitzgerald called fairy raths. And the one thing that happened with that show, which never impressed me that much, but this was interesting, is that they had a team out in the woods, walking through the woods, and they were the other team members were over back by the remains of this house, and they were shooting with a thermal camera, and they caught the team walking on thermal through the woods. Very clearly you could see them, and then about 30-40 feet behind them were three very short figures walking upright, following them.
Wow.
You know, the figures looked about, I mean, maybe I would say 2.5 feet tall compared to them, and we're in a line and just following them. And this lasted several minutes, and then the figures vanished. I think, I don't know if they called them on the radio to tell them, but it was very clear on the thermal camera that these figures were caught. And it was in this area where there was supposed to be this fairy rath where the fairies were living.
Wow. So yeah, interesting. It could be caught on thermal camera as well then.
I think it's at times, I think a lot of this type of phenomenon can be lumped together. You mentioned earlier about, you know, UFO aliens or whatnot, these fairy-like type people, even, you know, larger cryptids like Bigfoot or whatnot, which seem to have the ability to appear and disappear. And we say they have all these special qualities. And lately, I'm just beginning to think it's very natural qualities. And it's us who are the ones that have a problem with perception, are we're only able to use our five senses. We have a sixth sense that most of us don't use as much, that could possibly perceive these entities or creatures. It's like the story I told of the woman who saw what looked like an alien in her room. I don't believe it was a quote unquote alien. I've heard stories of people dealing with what looked like gray aliens, but the phenomenon happening did not seem extraterrestrial in nature. A prime example would be, there was a friend of mine, John Edmonds, who owned a ranch down in Arizona called the Stardust Ranch. and I don't know if you've heard of it.
I've heard you talk about him. Yeah,
Yeah.
he's passed away now, hasn't he?
Yeah, he passed away a few months ago, unfortunately, and I heard the ranch just went up for auction. So I have no idea. His wife moved out. I have no idea who bought it, what's going to happen with it, and the amount of activity that went on at that ranch rivaled, in my opinion, maybe even in some ways surpassed what happens up at the Skinwalker Ranch in Utah.
Hmm.
And especially, they lived there over 20 years, and 20 years with this activity before they became public, and they came public with their story. And they were dealing with, they did see UFOs, they did see craft in the sky, but a lot of the phenomenon seemed to be happening on the land and underground. And they
Hmm.
would have these alien grays appearing a lot. They were abducted a lot. They were both suffering from medical issues. And he and his wife, he claims to have killed a few of them. He had a big samurai katana sword
Mm-hmm.
that he used, and he said once he killed them, they would just vanish, except unless you took the head.
Wow, that
You-
sounds very Hollywood.
yeah, yeah, and get out of here, pain in my butt, cats. Um, yeah, but they even they've had a lot of people go out and document activity on the ranch. He did some interviews, and one interview, in the doorway behind him, you see a gray alien peeking out.
Oh, wow.
And other people have gone out there and they've had lots of experiences. Even the show Ghost Adventures went out there, and their only alien related episode they ever did. And they went out there and they had all sorts of experiences, seeing not only UFOs in the sky, but poltergeist like activity, strange mists and whatnot moving through the house. Very, I don't know, again, beyond just what you would call UFO activity. And it seemed centered on the land, something underground. Now, some people can sit here and say, well, it was maybe a UFO base underground. That's what they think is happening at the Skinwalker Ranch. And I'm beginning to think it might be something more. Um, an example would be there's the phenomenon of Tommyknockers. The miners, especially
Yeah,
like the Welsh miners, start talking
yeah.
about Tommyknockers, these creatures that they would encounter. And usually it was invisible, causing mischief. People would hear
Mm.
voices and whatnot, and it kind of fits in with the lore of the fairies living underground, the elves, the gnomes, things interdimensional or some other type of creatures and living entities living under the ground.
Mm.
I had my own experience once, actually twice. One was a mine I investigated. Now, people died in the mines, so I didn't know if I was dealing with human spirits or whatnot. But I investigated a cave system that's open to the public, and I got to go in there when it was closed. And no one's ever died in this cave. The
Mm-hmm.
local Native Americans never went in the cave. Uh, and yet, in the very back of the cave, we investigated, and we had all sorts of activity happening back there, between lights, unexplained lights shining, to hearing music. I was using a spirit box, and we're like, you know, 100 feet underground. There's no way radio signals could
Yeah,
penetrate, and yet
yeah.
in the spirit box we had some music come through. We had voices. We would hear voices, and we recorded EVPs. We had one clear EVP saying "Get out,"
Wow.
and but if nobody died there, okay. There's never been a recorded death. It was not used as a mine or anything. It was just a natural cave system used as a tourist attraction for many years. So what was down there?
Yeah,
Um,
yeah.
there is another guy. He has a YouTube channel called Exploring Abandoned Mines. You can look him up on YouTube.
Mm-hmm.
And about 10 years ago, he went into a couple of mines in around the California Nevada border, and he went into these mines. Now, normally he's just a spelunker. He's not a paranormal guy at all. But he would go into these mines sometimes by himself, recording the whole time and just showing the different how they tunneled out the mine, the different support systems they use. He'd show some of the old equipment, which was like 80 to 100 years old. And on two different occasions, he was deep in a mine this one time, and all of a sudden, out of nowhere, these whispered voices very loudly could be heard. And he kind of whipped around. He's looking, went, what in the hell? And then it stopped. And then after a minute, it started again. And he finally said, nope, I'm out of here. That's it.
Wow.
But again, it was like two voices were having a heavy whispered conversation just a few feet away from him. Well, there's nobody there.
Wow.
Nobody. Another time he went to this mine that had a bad reputation for supposedly activity. He didn't get much farther than the portal, which is the opening to the mine. It was a very large opening to the mine. There was a lot of water, and in the background, you could see chains hanging from the ceiling. And all of a sudden, way in the back, you could see these two chains just swinging wildly. There was no wind, there was no nothing, but
Mm.
something was causing those chains, like a warning to stay out.
Excellent. Excellent.
So, what are we dealing with here? Ghosts? I don't think it's
Well,
simple.
it interesting that it occurs in the darkness again, though. You see, inside the ground, and these beings, whatever they are, or something, is in the darkness a lot of the time. And I'd imagine that this like the gnomes were in the dark, manifesting. It kind of reminds me a little bit of seances, particularly what they call physical materialization seances. They would have to be conducted in the dark, and the only time you could put a light on it generally was an infrared lamp. Now, interesting, I was watching something on YouTube with some physicist guy explaining the experiments they've done with infrared light and other kind of high-powered lights and things, but infrared light has less photons on a certain frequency or something like that. So it made me wonder, maybe this is why they use these red lights in a seance, because it can light the room enough, but it's not harmful apparently to the materialized spirit phenomena. There's a case investigated by scientists. Well, this science was Sir William Crookes. I think he invented the cathode ray tube, amongst other things. But he was investigating. He was a leading scientist of the Victorian times, I think. But he investigated this materialized spirit called Katie King. She would materialize in the seance room in the infrared. That Florence Cook was the medium, and she was only a girl of 15, so she really didn't have the know-how of how to do fakery, I would imagine, at the age of 15. But she was a really, really good natural medium. But somehow she could manifest this physical being. Now, how they did it was they produced this stuff called ectoplasm, which again is very sensitive to the light. If you open like daylight to this stuff, it'll come back into the body of the medium and can damage them and make them ill. It's happened in a few cases where mediums have been injured. Subsequently, they've died from those injuries. So it's a very real risk to them. But this ectoplasm seems to be made from plasma of blood cells in some way. And they take it from everybody, not just the medium. They take it from everybody in the room to build up a shape. And it'll only be a temporary form. It only might last a few seconds, a few minutes, maybe half an hour, depending on how much power they've got. But this Katie King could materialize. She could talk. She even held William Crookes's 3-week-old baby boy that had been born by his wife, and she said, "Can I see your new baby?" So the baby was brought into the room and then into the next room where Katie King was, and she held the baby. So you got a case of a physical, materialized, deceased spirit holding a human baby and going, "Oh, coochie coochie coo," or something, Um, but on another occasion, this Katie King materialized in another seance with some other mediums. and she was asked, "Can we see what happens to you in the daylight?" And so this Katie King spirit said, "Okay," and she sort of sat flat against the wall, and they drew back the curtains, and she literally started to dissolve in front of them. Rather like, I mean, the description I read reminded me very much of the spirit. No, not the spirit. The Nazis melting in Raiders of the Lost Ark at the end of the movie when they open up the ark and the powers come out and they all start melting. And the description said the eyeballs fell into the back of the skull, the nose caved in, the arms kind of decomposed or something, and she eventually just dissipated into the floor. And that was in the daylight. So it makes me wonder that obviously if the light of normal daylight has some effect, this is perhaps why we're experiencing this from our underground in caves, because it's like almost like a seance room, and whatever it can manifest safely in there, maybe it doesn't have to manifest a physical person, but the phenomena can take place where it can move chains or make noises, that kind of stuff, almost like poltergeist activity. And again, these gnomes in the woods, they appeared in the darkness just enough to be seen by the kids. Um, and you know, and this is where you get these legends of spirits appearing at night. And these guys, Owen and his friend, were walking home at the bar in the evening, and they saw this huge 50-foot woman sitting on the roof of the church, presumably in the early evening or maybe middle of the night. I'm not quite sure what time that was, but it would be very rare for a spirit to be seen in the daytime. And let's face it, you know, you ask any ghost hunter, when do you go out? And they say, oh, always at nighttime. And they perhaps don't even know why themselves they go at nighttime. You could say, oh, it's because they work in the day, and that's understandable, and so they go out at night in their free time. But most people will go out in the night because they expect to see something or feel or hear something. And I suspect it's something to do with the fact that nighttime is the safety factor for spirits to manifest in some way.
Well, I have two comments on that. One being, look at how many people who experience different types of phenomenon, whether it's possibly extraterrestrial or some other type of spiritual phenomenon. What's the famous hour between 2 and 3 in the morning?
Yeah.
Dead of night is when they have these experiences. And yet in the investigations I've done plenty of investigations during the day,
Mm,
and I've caught stuff during
right.
the day. So I always believed it could happen 24/7. Usually at night, what I preferred is just because it's quiet.
Mm,
At nighttime, it's easier to use and see infrared photography if you got a light faint mist that you may not catch when it's brighter out, and
yeah.
you could catch in infrared light. Um, and it again, the ambience in the mood. Now maybe it some activity is more at night. I don't know. In But that was also dealing with more traditional haunting like activity, and
Yeah.
I've had plenty of stories of people who said they've seen ghosts in the bright, in daylight. But with these creatures, on to my second point, is they could be similar to a phenomenon that's a very real medical phenomenon, and I forget the name of it off the top of my head, but they used it as a plot device in that Nicole Kidman movie, The Others.
Oh, yeah. Yeah.
Okay, about her children not being able to go out in daylight
Yeah.
because they had a medical condition
Mm, mm,
that could kill them, make them very sick, being out in the daylight. Um, Now that is a real medical condition. I've heard of it, but now you've got me thinking maybe because the big plot twist is, and spoiler alert here, people, they were already dead. They were the ghosts. um, Maybe that's why the children couldn't go outside,
yeah.
because maybe it was very similar to this phenomenon. They couldn't, as in spirit form, be going out in the daylight. And
Yeah.
even when she went out at one point in the daylight and met her husband, it was shrouded in a
In
mist.
fog or something. Yeah, it
Yeah,
was.
so
Yeah.
there was no direct sunlight. So maybe knowingly or unknowingly, the filmmakers brought that fact into it, because when dealing with these types of creatures, as you mentioned, it always seems to take place at night or in the dark, never in direct sunlight.
There was a famous medium from Brazil. I think he came from Portugal, or was half descended from Portuguese parents that lived in Brazil, called Carmine Mirabelli, who I believe it was the 1920s. He was producing phenomena in the daylight, but he was a very rare exception. I mean, he was actually widely examined by the authorities in Brazil at the time, including the president of Brazil at the time and his scientists, the military, engineers, all sorts of people examined him. And they actually did like an investigation, a 3 or 4 year investigation into him, and asked him to produce all this kind of phenomena. Some he couldn't do all the time. Sometimes he said, sorry, it's not going to work today, guys, not the right conditions. But a lot of the time he could produce phenomena in broad daylight. He first came to the attention of authorities because he worked in his first job working in a shoe shop, and apparently when he would walk out the shoe shop, shoe boxes used to float down the street after him, and it freaked out his colleagues or something. So they reported him, and he was put in a mental asylum for 3 weeks where he was examined, and the doctors there said, look, this guy is not mental, but he has some unique magical force with him that should be examined further. And so that's when he started to attract the attention of the authorities on a deeper level. And so they set up all these seances and everything, and there was cases, and they photographed them, of people just materializing in thin air, and then descending down into a garden, open air garden, or these people would come out of the ceiling and just descend into the floor. And land on the floor. They didn't even have to come out of a seance cabinet in the traditional, the British kind of seances that we'd had over here. And these people, there was one case of a child who had died maybe 3 months earlier. She materialized in all her clothes. She agreed to be examined. They took her pulse and everything. There was a case of a doctor.
Wait, just to back up a little bit. So she had actually died and came back in a physical form to the point where they could physically touch her and check her vitals.
Yeah. I mean, that's happened in other seances. They've actually taken the pulse. I mentioned Katie King. They took her pulse and could feel her pulse clearly. So when these spirits manifest, they somehow can literally reproduce a facsimile of their human body. Some cases, it seems to be that they don't have to reproduce everything, because there's been cases where people have lifted up their dresses and shown there's no legs there. They only manufacture what they have to manufacture to be seen. So, the guy could take his clothes off and there'd be nothing underneath. But, it takes a lot of energy to produce a full materialization. So they only sort of materialize what they have to show. It's almost like a stage set in the sense of that, you'll see a film, but you'll only see the front of the saloon bar. The rest is just props behind it. But from the film's point of view, it looks real. And I think that's what they're doing in these cases of these materializations. But sometimes when there's enough energy, they can produce a full-bodied materialization. There's been experiments, even with the lady Leslie Kean, the UFO author. She's looked into life after death. I know she had a series on Netflix last year or the year before. But she's done presentations where she's been to examine these wax casts made in the 1930s or 40s. I think it was there in a museum in France now. And they were concocted by scientists of the day in a seance because they were trying to prove that these spirits were there. And what they do was ask the materialized spirits to put their hands into molten wax, and then dematerialize whilst their hands are in the wax. And then they would pour in plaster casts of plaster that could only be, that's right, I'm trying to think, how did it work? Yeah, they stuck their hands in the wax, pulled their hands out, and they were dripping with wax over their hands, and then the spirit would dematerialize and just leave like the wax shell of their hand, and then they would pour in the plaster. And sometimes the fingers would be embraced like that, which would mean that you could not get the fingers in that shape without breaking the wax. And so obviously it proved that the fingers dematerialized inside the wax casing. And they even had hands that were huge hands that there was no one that big in the seance room, and they also had hands of children materialize. And again, there was no children in the seance room to put the blame on as such, you see. So this is very interesting stuff. But again, it all had to be in the dark. But in the case of Mirabelli in Brazil, for some peculiar reason, he could produce his in the daylight. And there's one thing that makes me wonder about it is the fact that there's the Van Allen radiation belts that circle the Earth.
Yeah.
Now, there's something where the radiation dips down over the South Atlantic. And it happens to dip down. They call it the South Atlantic anomaly. It dips down to about 200 miles above Brazil and South America. And I wondered, there always seems to be lots of UFO sightings in South America, Brazil, blah, 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 and this phenomena. And I was thinking, could it be something to do with the radiation? I don't know. It was just, intense radiation might produce extra energy, extra photons, extra particles. I don't know. It's just that we spoke to a chap last year on the Paranormal Peep Show who told us about his wife materialized in his bed next to him. She'd been dead 8 years, but he could feel her body. He could feel her leg. He knew it was her. Although it was in the dark in the room, he could absolutely feel her next to him in the bed. And he said he checked the next day and there was apparently a solar flare or something that night. So he wondered if that had something to do with her materialization. It provided extra power in some way for her to manifest. And so I took that idea and then wondered about these Mirabelli manifestations in the daylight and discovered that there's the South Atlantic anomaly of radiation going down right over Brazil, which would be attributable almost like a solar flare anyway, because it's still radiation. I don't know. It's just a hypothesis. I can't prove it because I'm not a scientist, but interesting stuff.
Well, just stepping back a couple of paces with these stories of people who have died and coming back in physical form. I mean, this might be controversial to some people, but what's one of the most famous stories of somebody who's died and come back in physical form? Is Jesus in the New Testament, in the Bible. And to the point where if you go back and read the text, and again, I'm not going on this on a religious angle, just based on the things that you can read. There were times when the apostles, after he died, they'd be gathered together, they'd be walking along and they'd be talking about things, and then somebody would just suddenly be next to them and asking questions and talking to them, and they wouldn't really realize who the person was. And then all of a sudden, until they vanished in front of them. Sounds exactly like a lot of stories we hear about. Then there were the times when Jesus physically appeared to them. And even Thomas, who doubted the whole thing, Jesus said, "Look, here, feel my hands, feel the, you can see the wounds in my hands, feel the sword side." He come back fully in the physical and then yet would still disappear. And people look at this, Christians look at this as, the big, religious phenomenon. Oh my God, Jesus come back. He's the only one who could do this. Well, here's all this other documented cases to show that it's not a unique phenomenon.
Yeah. Also, I think in the Bible it says Jesus ascended on a cloud into heaven. He was cited to. And the cloud, I wondered about that because I thought about this too with Jesus. I wondered because there's lots of misty stuff that appears sometimes around this phenomena, which could be unprocessed ectoplasm, maybe, because they say it appears as a mist first, then forms into a solid. So that when people see Jesus going up into a cloud, it could be that he's slowly dematerializing and it's returning back to its misty shape, and so he's actually dissolving. But they interpret it that he's floating on a cloud back up to heaven, like that's his chariot up to heaven or something. But again, he's going back upwards. And these Mirabelli cases, the guy in Brazil, their spirits were coming down from heaven, if you like. And then when it's then time to go, they would go back up. So that's interesting, isn't it? It kind of repeats the same thing. And again, in daytime.
What else was I going to say here? I had a thought and I lost it here. Oh, I hate it when that happens. It's getting old here. Yeah, with the types of phenomenon that's described going in ancient texts going back forever. I remember now, Whitley Strieber had mentioned in his books with Communion, in his later books, Transformation, during some of his initial original encounters back in the mid to late 80s, that he would encounter on these craft people he knew. There was
Interesting.
one guy in particular that he knew and was there physically, and he talked to him. And then it was after the encounter was over, he found out a few days later that the guy had died about a week before.
Oh, wow.
So the guy was dead and yet appeared physically in the craft. And Whitley has long talked about the fact that he feels that these visitors, as he calls them, are directly involved with us, not only on a spiritual level, but, our afterlife spirits, after we've gone, they're still able to interact. And in a way, it makes sense to me, because if all this other phenomenon we've talked about tonight, from these fairies and gnomes and whatnot, they seem to float in and out. Some of these ghostly like apparitions coming in and out of our reality. Uh, if once we have shed these meat suits and moved on, where are we able to be in that realm? We call it the spirit realm right now because that's all we understand, or going to heaven or whatnot. But it's actually the next level of reality, or a higher vibration. We mentioned light, and light has a certain vibration. And the light spectrum, we only see this little sliver of
Yeah.
visible light, where it actually, the light spectrum goes way out on either end to the infrared or the ultraviolet, and x-rays, gamma rays, all sorts of
Mm.
different types of frequencies are involved in that light spectrum. So maybe it's just that physical light spectrum that these entities have a problem with, and that's what we can perceive with our eyes. And but they are very much interactive in the other directions, the other
Yeah.
vibrations of the light spectrum.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, we have trouble seeing them in their spectrum, but I think they can downshift and come to ours perhaps a lot easier. I think also because when you pass on with the knowledge that you did exist in a material world before. So therefore, you can kind of accept that you do exist after death. So therefore, you've got an expanded load of possibilities in your mind. Whereas when you're here and you don't believe in this sort of stuff, you're probably going to be harder to kind of see this phenomena because you just don't believe it exists. However, there are some people that experience these things, but they don't obviously always want to see them, and they could just be more naturally inclined to see that sort of thing. But the vast majority of people don't always see it because they're so wrapped up in the physical. But there's some interesting cases of sometimes these things defy explanation. A lot of times there is, I don't know how long you got now, but an interesting story I must tell you before I forget, about a medium called Hunter Selkirk, who lived in the northeast of England in the 1940s and 50s. And he was pretty much an incredible medium by all accounts. He died in 1965 at the age of 65, but he was a very mild mannered guy. He wasn't boastful at all. He was just very humble about his abilities, and yet he could do brilliant clairvoyance in spiritualist churches, get all the facts right and everything. But he also had exceptional, brilliant materialization skills, and sometimes it would happen quite without him being aware. And there was a tale that I read in a book last year where he was going to do some table tilting, which is where you put your hands on the table and it rocks about with the spirit's help or something, with a couple of guys. So they said, look, let's choose a table, let's bring it out to the middle of the room. And as they started to bring it out to the middle of the room, this guy Hunter Selkirk suddenly just went and fell into a trance quite unwittingly. He didn't know it was going to happen, and he kind of just sort of stood there in a trance, leaning across the table. And these two witnesses were aghast to see ectoplasm coming out of his nostrils down onto the table, and they went into two separate streams, and then they both forged upwards and both became one female figure about a foot high and one male figure about a foot high standing on this table, and they materialized into Elizabethan characters from the Elizabethan age. So they had those kind of frilly collars.
Right.
And the people, the witnesses, could even see like the tiny belt buckles on their shoes and on their belts and everything, and see the laces on their cuffs and everything like that. And they said that these two figures, the man and lady, were completely white in color, like all ghosts are white, but these were completely white in color, only about a foot high. And they turned to the witnesses and they bowed to them in a courteous bow that one might do in an Elizabethan court, like very period kind of stuff they did, and bowed to them. Then they bowed to each other and they both dematerialized. And then the ectoplasm went back up into Hunter Selkirk's nostrils. And then he awoke and he said, "Oh, what's happened? What have I missed?" And he literally was not aware of this whole thing. And these guys were so dumbstruck they could not say anything because they just saw this thing that was totally spontaneously happened. An amazing story.
See, it's this type of thing that fascinates me, and it's one of the reasons I am doing this show, because a lot of what we're talking about tonight, there's going to be people who are going to have a real hard time believing it.
Yeah.
But I have to point out to people, we have to look at the fact that, again, we as physical beings, and especially being brought up in our society, in a Western society, we have a lot programmed out of us as kids. Kids are more open and able to see and interact with things that adults can't see, because they haven't grown up and had the ability diminish or be programmed out of them. As I've mentioned many times before, how many times I had some experiences when I was young, and if I tried to tell my parents, my mother would always go, "Oh, it's just your imagination, or you dream something," and blow it off. So you start to get programmed not to believe things, and then you start believing what society tells you over time. You grow into that culture. But then if you grew up in a culture that's more open and accepting of these types of phenomena, there's a good chance that you would have more of these experiences. Uh, Again, I also still think that still as humans, our abilities have been suppressed for one reason or another. There's uh, a lot of different phenomena you can blame it on. That could be a whole nother show in itself. But I think, yeah, we have the ability, it's within us to be able to perceive and interact on this level. It's just kind of switched off for most people right now, or vastly tuned down the dial. So it's very difficult to experience it. Yet all of this is real. It's happening all around us, whether we want to admit it or not.
Yeah, unfortunately, we're so focused on our little TVs, or big TVs as they are now, about what's going on out there. And I think sometimes we really should be wondering what's going on in here, really, because that's, I think, where the true story lies, because whatever happens out here always becomes whatever is out there as anyway. All these things that happen, they're all come out the minds of people, really, I think, at the end of the day. All the problems and all the good things.
Yeah, and getting back to one of the original points we talked about, which is I think is part of it, is whatever it is that we're dealing with, which we try to classify, we try to give them names. And a lot of the names and classifications can be culturally based depending on where you are in the world, but we still don't know for certain. Yet it's there. It's part of who we are. It's part of our reality. And it's if we can, whether through meditation, whether through trying to find a way to communing more with nature, getting out of our Western society, getting out of the clutter, getting away from these damn things, and and being more in tune, I think a lot more people would be having in these experiences, and maybe we'd start having a better understanding of what it is that's all around us.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, it's interesting that more people flocked to spiritualism in the First World War and the Second World War as they started to lose people, and I think it goes in and out of fashion. And I think really, it'll probably kick off again maybe if something big happens, in the next 10 years or so, where maybe a lot of people die from some plague or something that might be going around, and it'll rise again, and there'll be a new generation of mediums to cater for those requirements. But I think with shows like this discussing these things, retelling these stories that we've read or heard or experienced, it'll hopefully give food for thought to people, because they'll start to think, well, hang on, I've never heard of this, why haven't I heard of that? I mean, that's one of the things that when spirits have come back through mediums, there was a voice medium, a direct voice medium called Leslie Flynn, who could produce the voices of spirits. He wrote a book called Voices in the Dark about his experiences. But one of the many things that these spirits would say when they came back was, why were we never told about this when we were on Earth? We now live in this other world that we experienced, but we were never told about it when on Earth. And I kind of get the feeling the whole thing's like being suppressed.
Mm-hmm.
They don't want people to know about it.
Depending on who they are.
Yeah,
yeah, lots
exactly.
of different people.
Yeah. The elite, the Illuminati, I don't know.
Yeah, even
Yeah.
Who knows? It's but you're right. Again, it's something that we need to be open to. And that's the thing I always tell people who listen to this show, especially, is we're presenting ideas. You don't have to believe it, you don't have to accept it. But I'm telling you right now, I've learned things here tonight that I've never heard of before. So again, it's food for thought. It's gonna make me do some more deeper research into some of this phenomenon, because it's some of this was brand new to me too.
Yeah. So I'd say to people, look out for Katie King, Hunter Selkirk. Can't think of the other spirits now, but there are a few to get on with that they might want to investigate. Very, very interesting stuff.
Fantastic. Well, Neil, thank you so much for coming on the show tonight. This is, like I said,
Pleasure.
been very, very informative. Now, where you're going to be making some appearances here soon?
Where?
Oh, I thought I saw something that you were going to be are you going to be appearing in any conferences or anything?
Oh, not in the United States. I thought you meant in the United States. No, in the UK, I'm going to be doing some conferences at the Cornwall UFO conference, which is coming up in October. I can't remember the date, maybe the 11th of October, or is that the other one? I don't know. But I'm also going to be talking about aliens on the moon at East Anglia UFO group, where Rendlesham Forest was. So that's like both a week apart. So yeah, I'm doing an appearance at both places. So if people want to come and see me talk about this sort of stuff and other stuff, either go to the UFO conference down in Truro in Cornwall in the UK, or go to the East Anglia UFO group, Ipswich, I think it might be. I can't remember now, but I'll certainly let people know. I'll put it out there some way.
And then, of course, everyone can catch you and Andrew Chaplin on the Paranormal Peep Show every third Thursday here on the Paranormal UK Radio Network.
Absolutely, yeah. We've been doing it for about coming up 6 years now, I think. So it's really rushed by. Wow.
And then, of course, I do have to give that shout out to the article that we found this week, where the network is listed as the #1 paranormal network.
Wow, that's brilliant news. I'm pleased to hear that. I think we can all give ourselves a pat on the back for that then.
Yes, yes, that's very good news to hear, because sometimes it's really hard to understand rankings when you're dealing with the internet. But when you have independent websites and studies coming out and ranking people, we got listed as #1. So I'm really pleased with that.
And long may it continue. Brilliant.
Yeah. Well, again, thank you very much, and you have a wonderful evening.
Thank you very much for inviting me. It's been a pleasure. Thank you.
And that was Neil Geddes-Ward, co-host of the Paranormal Peep Show here on the Paranormal UK Radio Network. And I just want to thank him for coming on. And I want to thank everyone else for tuning in to this edition of Astral Perceptions. We'll come back in 2 weeks. We have another great guest all lined up, and I really hope that you enjoy as we continue to move along. Again, as I mentioned to people, you don't always have to believe everything that we talk about here. I try to keep an open forum discussion. So, well, if you have any comments, please feel free to send them our way. More than happy to respond to any feedback we get. Thank you, everyone, and you all have a great day. Bye-bye.